Well, hello everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm excited to present this project to this room of experts on the work from home. So today I'm going to present my work that I started during my PhD at the University of Pittsburgh and that I'm continuing now at the University of Lausanne. So I guess like all of us in this room, I was initially motivated by the persistent post-pandemic shift to work from home that happened in the US and across the world. And in my project, I'm interested in looking at the implications of this shift for policy. In particular, I'm looking at the policies like national progressive income tax and the restrictive housing regulations, and these are the policies that have been documented to hurt the aggregate productivity because they disincentivize workers from working for the most productive firms in the most productive cities. Restrictive housing regulations just physically limit the amount of space that is available for workers in those high productivity cities. And national progressive income tax taxes those workers that earn higher wages in those most productive cities at a higher rate, again disincentivizing them for working in those productive cities. So in this project, I want to look how this dramatic shift to work from home affects those policy distortions. So in principle, it can exacerbate or alleviate those distortions. And the reason why it can help with aggregate productivity, I guess, is more straightforward. Firms now have this work from home option that allows them to substitute expensive in-person workers for cheaper workers that work remotely, because those workers don't require office space, and also they can probably accept some wage cut because they can view the remote option as an amenity for them. In addition, the firms in most productive places now are not constrained by the local labor market. They can hire from all over the US economy. So they get access to this national pool of remote workers that effectively sustains this winner-takes-all effect, where the labor is reallocated from the less productive firms to the more productive firms in high productivity cities. And that increases the realized output in the economy. However, the same policies can also suppress the supply of remote workers and in-person labor in most productive cities, thus putting a brake on the winner-takes-all effect. So whereas the realized output goes up because of the winner-takes-all effect, the potential output that the economy can achieve in the work-from-home world can increase by even more than the realized output, thus increasing the gap between the potential and the realized output, increasing the size of the distortions. So it can go either way, and this is why I want to build a spatial equilibrium model that will allow me to run the policy experiments calibrated to the US data. And after running those experiments, I find that in the long run, the shift to work from home increases the productivity loss due to tax progressivity. But the effect of housing regulations is ambiguous depending on the specification of the model. So to give you some concrete numbers, I find that moving to flat income tax schedule from the current tax schedule in the US increases output by an extra 1 percentage point in the world with work from home compared to 2019. Which in relative numbers means a 57% increase in output. But because we know that work from home access is not even across different sectors of the economy, for example, workers in sectors like information or finance are more likely to work remotely than workers in sectors like warehousing or transportation due to the physical nature of those sectors. There's also this inequality component to the work from home shift. And what my model shows is that basically in the world of work from home, this equity efficiency trade-off is exacerbated compared to the 2019 economy, meaning that the size of productivity loss increases, but if we will try to remove that productivity loss, we will increase inequality by more. So if you want to decrease inequality, you will have to lose more productivity, and vice versa in the with work from home. So I contribute to mainly 3 different strands of literature. Of course, there has been already a lot of papers written on the spatial implications of work from home, many of which have been presented here. There is also a vast literature in macroeconomics talking about the spatial misallocation due to tax progressivity or housing supply restrictions. And I also contribute to the discussion of the superstar cities and firms, where this winner-takes-all effect here is basically facilitated by the work from home. So it's another channel through which the winner-takes-all effect can operate. So these data, I think all of us have seen already, but just 2 main points is that the share of remote workers have drastically increased since 2019, and that this share has stabilized since then, despite all the recent pushback from some firms and the US administration, even in the most recent data from October 2025. And the second point that you can see here is that the access to remote work has not been equal for workers, say, with a university degree and without one. The second fact that is important for my paper is that while the share of remote workers and their wages have been stable for a few years now, the fact that you can think that the transition to this new work from home equilibrium has not been completed yet. And one margin along which I can see that is the changes in residences, basically how much people move. And you can see in this graph that people who work remotely are much more likely to move than those people who don't. And while before the 2019, before the pandemic, these shares have been relatively the same, after the pandemic is a huge jump, and the series have not converged back to being equal yet. So there is still some transition going on in the economy, and therefore it is important to model this work from home shift as opposed to just taking the new equilibrium from the data. So I guess for the sake of time, I will not go through the full model, but let me just give you a brief overview and the building pieces. So as I mentioned, because there is this inequality component in access to work from home, I'm going to have 2 worker types, exogenous worker types in my model, lower skilled and higher skilled workers. I'm going to have many different locations characterized by production and residential amenities, which are going to have the exogenous part and the endogenous part, or the agglomeration effects. Each location is going to be characterized by its own housing supply function, which is going to be subject to the local housing supply regulations. And there's going to be a matrix of commuting costs between physical locations. So if you choose to work one and live in another, you're going to pay a commuting cost. And in addition, in each location, you're also going to have the location-specific cost of working remotely. I'm going to model the market for remote labor. This is the crucial piece in my model, as the national market for remote labor. So basically, firms in San Francisco do not necessarily care if the worker is in San Francisco or in Atlanta, in Pittsburgh, or in New York. And then I'm also going to have standard local markets for in-person labor. Households in my model are going to choose in which location to live and in which location to work, where I code the remote work as option 0, like this national market for remote work, and the physical locations are all the other locations. There's going to be production of the consumption good in my model, which is going to combine the floor space and the remote and in-person labor of both types. And this good is going to be freely traded across the economy. And then finally and crucially, I'm going to have distortions in my model. The endogenous supply of housing constrained by local regulations. So basically, this is going to be captured by the housing supply elasticity parameters at the local level. And I'm going to have progressive income tax at the national level that funds redistribution between households with different wage levels, as well as some national government spending. Any questions about the model? So just to be precise, the two aggregate, I'm going to concentrate on the aggregate outcomes in my model, and the two things I'm looking at in particular is the GDP, which in my model is the total wage bill plus the earnings of absentee landlords, and the ex-ante expected welfare of workers of each type. So I'm going to do different kinds of experiments in my model. The first experiment I do is the work from home shock, and motivated by the fact that the share of remote workers has increased and stabilized, and the workers who work remotely have been experiencing stagnant wages, I'm going to calibrate the work from home shock to match these facts by increasing the productivity of remote work for firms and simultaneously decreasing the cost of remote work for households. So to generate this increase in quantity of remote work while keeping the wages of remote work the same. And after I obtain my counterfactual work from home economy, I'm going to run two types of policy experiments with the regional economy in 2019 and the counterfactual economy that fully adjusted to the work from home shock. I can change the degree of tax progressivity and compare the two economies, or I can change local housing supply elasticity and again compare the two economies. So I take some elasticities from the existing literature, and then I calibrate the economy to the 2019 data from the ACS, which gives me the residence workplace matrix, wages of remote workers and in-person workers by location, and local rents. Each location is going to correspond to the lowest level at which the wage data is available. So one workplace PUMA, which is roughly equivalent to one county in the census data. And then to calibrate the work from home shock, I'm going to take the 2022 national shares of wages, national shares of remote workers and their wages. And the final piece is to take the housing supply elasticities at the local level from Baum, Snow, and Han. So before I preview the results of my policy experiments, I want to say that just the work from home adjustment itself, so the shift to work from home, increases the output in the economy in my model by roughly 3 percentage points, and also increases the inequality by roughly 5 percentage points, where most of this comes from the increase in the ex-ante expected welfare of higher skilled workers. So lower skilled workers do not lose much in my model from the shift to work from home, but the high skilled workers gain. And then on top of these changes, I'm going to run the tax progressivity and housing supply elasticity experiments. So on this graph, I'm going to plot the results of the tax progressivity experiments, where on the y-axis you have the change in aggregate output, or GDP. On the x-axis you have the degree of tax progressivity, where 0.18 corresponds to the current degree of tax progressivity in the US. The blue line is the experiment run with the baseline 2019 economy, and the red line is the experiment run with the work from home economy that has fully adjusted to the work from home shift. So you can see that I normalized the change in output to 1, despite that the work from home itself has brought some initial increase in output. And then I'm going to look at the changes in output on top of the initial jump in GDP. So as I move the economy from the initial degree of tax progressivity to the flat tax income schedule, which corresponds to the tax progressivity parameter equal to 0, you can see how output increases in both economies, but it increases by much more in the work from home economy. So there is this additional gain in output in the world with work from home. Basically meaning that tax progressivity in the world with work from home has become more costly. So next I'm trying to decompose this gap into different channels. Basically, the gap, the output can increase when the most productive firms are going to hire more in-person workers, as well as they're going to hire more remote workers. So to decompose the full effect, I'm going to fix some outcomes in my model and rerun the experiment after fixing some outcomes. So to extract the direct effect of in-person work on the full effect, I'm going to fix the number of remote workers in the economy and only allow the number of in-person workers to change. Whereas to decompose the part of the full effect that is driven by the work from home workers, I'm going to fix the number of in-person workers in the most productive cities while allowing the number of remote workers to change. And so you can see that this 1 percentage point gap between the 2019 economy and the 2019 economy with the work from home is generated by this additional direct effect of work from home on productivity. I can also talk a little bit about, I don't think I have enough time, but I can talk about the result of the experiment where I changed the housing supply elasticities in the most constrained places to be at the medium level. And for those experiments, I also have some gap, but as I said, that will not be robust to different specifications of the model. And the reason for that is because whereas tax progressivity directly affects both the supply of in-person and remote workers, the housing regulations only directly affect the supply of in-person workers. They do not impact the supply of remote workers. So this is why this result will be ambiguous, but this result is going to be robust to different specifications because this part is always going to add additional productivity gains. And then, I only have a few minutes, I'm going to I want to discuss the welfare implications of the tax progressivity experiments. So once again, I have the degree of tax progressivity on the x-axis, the change in ex-ante welfare on the y-axis, and the blue lines are corresponding to the 2019 economy, and the red lines corresponding to the work-from-home economy. So this is the change in welfare for the college-educated workers, and this is the change in welfare for non-college-educated workers. And as we reduce tax progressivity to flat income taxation, of course, we're going to have less redistribution, so less skilled workers are going to suffer because of that. But then you can also see that there's an additional gap that arises in the world with work from home. So this effectively means that if you want to reduce this inequality in the world with work from home, you will have to hurt the productivity more if you're going to do it through tax progressivity, for progressive taxation. And I'm also trying to decompose where this difference in welfare is coming from. So you can have different channels for this. You can have the effect of housing prices. You can have the effect of wages. And in my experiments, I mainly find that the wage channel is the most prominent. So basically what happens in my model is that with the access to work from home, the higher skilled workers in less productive places can switch from local production to the most productive firms in the most productive cities, thus hurting the production at the less productive places. As that happens, there is a reduction in the demand for lower skilled work as well, because the high skill and low skill labor are complementary to an extent. So there's a fall in demand for remote workers, and that pushes their wages down. And where the work from home is important here is that less skilled workers cannot escape this reduction in wages and employment opportunities because they have less access to remote work compared to higher skilled workers. And that is the main reason for this additional gap in inequality. So to conclude, I want to, so I'm in this paper, I'm studying the dramatic shift to work from home post the pandemic, and I find that it exacerbates the spatial distortions due to tax progressivity by suppressing the winner-takes-all effect, but the effect of spatial distortions due to housing regulations is ambiguous. However, if we simply flatten the tax schedule, we're going to generate a mechanical increase in inequality, which is now exacerbated by the fact that low-skilled workers have less access to work from home. So altogether, the work from home intensifies the equity-efficiency trade-off in the spatial setting. So to get more productivity, you have to increase the inequality more, and vice versa. And this essentially underscores the need for more nuanced tax policy. Yeah. That's all I have. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much. So first question would be, I think there are, I could see 3 channels on increasing inequality, which I guess 1 or maybe 2 I thought of, but 1 I totally hadn't. So one is that basically higher educated people are more able to work from home, so they get an amenity, and I think you mentioned it earlier, it's just, so that comes up all the time. The second is, I hadn't thought of as much, which is that they also get better access to labor markets. So if you're higher educated, you're already earning more, but you can also access a much bigger labor market, which on average is better for them. The third thing, I guess, I hadn't thought of at all, which is it also makes the kind of progressivity, it makes it more costly to have high taxes because labor's come more mobile.
Yes.
And therefore, that's going to push down tax rates, which again, if you think of part of that as redistribution. And so, I don't know, somehow tax has to be raised, but you raise it in different ways, less on labor income and more, say, on sales taxes or something. But all 3 of them push in the same direction, I think, in your model. So,
yes, I think the fact that basically this is another implication I can mention in my paper is that yes, high-skilled workers now become more sensitive to taxation. I wanted to look at this from the local perspective, from the local taxation, but the data for that is a bit harder to get. So I'm looking at it from the national perspective. I don't know how to like tease out these effects in my model, because I can fix certain outcomes in the model. I have to think a little bit more about how I can tease out it in the model.
There's some evidence on the final one, by the way, already places like Tulsa remote. It's
yes.
quite taxed,
yes.
but you're basically paying a subsidy. It's not that, oddly enough, it's not Tulsa, it's some charity, but you're paying a subsidy to attract very footloose, high-skilled labor, and there's a bunch of places that are now having these special zones for work-from-home workers. So it's kind of, it's not like the state of California isn't really changing it as of yet, but it is starting to happen, yeah.
Thanks. There's already a lot going on in your model, but there's, as I understand it, there's a lot left out too that affects the productivity calculation, the output calculations in particular. So let me just mention 3. One, Nick already alluded to, but which is that the scope for better matching in the labor market is improved among those workers who can work remotely, essentially because the market's now national, not localized. That reduces matching frictions, but more importantly, it untethers location from workplace. And so each firm that hires remote workers is now can search in a national market and find the best suited workers. So that's one. Second, you don't talk about this, but it seems to me important. Cities also differ in the efficiency with which they transform tax revenues into publicly generated consumer amenities. Okay, so we live near a city that is famously suffered through a period of poor public governance. That's an extreme example of a city that doesn't effectively translate tax revenues into consumer amenities. Once you free up the ability of people to detach location, residential location from workplace location, there's a welfare benefit from that immediately, because people can now reallocate to those cities that are more efficient in transforming tax collections into consumer amenities. But second, there's much greater spatial intensity of the competition among cities for workers, for residents, excuse me, as a consequence. And if you think that spatial competition among cities leads them to improve their transformation of tax collections into consumer amenities, you'd get another benefit from that. So I say all this not as a criticism of your paper, but just to note that the full analysis of the two big questions you set out to ask, the output effects and the welfare effects, involves many elements, some of which are in your model and some of which aren't.
This is me. Okay, all right. So, yeah, great paper. I had a lot of interesting, it triggered a lot of interesting ideas. I was wondering, so if I think about your model more generally, this sounds sort of like the Enrico Moretti idea of like, you have the like coders downtown and they have to buy lunch and they have to buy haircuts, and that spills over into the low wage workers who now get high wages because they get to hang around these coders who need to get their lunches locally. And I think if I understand this correctly, the negative welfare effects here come from the fact that if the coders now all move to Boulder, Colorado, no one is in downtown San Francisco buying haircuts and sandwiches. And that's sort of that's bad for the local low wage workers who can't move to those places. I feel like in this setting, a lot of the benefits are going to come from how you model agglomeration densities, right? I think the way I understand it, I think you mostly focus on density as a driver of agglomeration in the paper. Is that right?
Yes.
Because it seems like one thing that's going to be crucial here is to understand the impact of work from home is whether or not physical location still remains the most important driver of agglomeration effects, right? Like, so somehow I can project all my work productivity across the globe, but my ideas all like fall into the forest outside my house and I can't actually talk to anyone about them. I think that's sort of how you're currently modeling it, but it would be interesting to see what happens if you think of agglomeration also as having a remote component in some ways and no longer being anchored to the physical location as much, because I think that might alleviate some of the negative effects, because if I don't need to be physically next to someone to benefit from their ideas, that makes it less negative that not everyone is hanging out in the same coffee shops downtown.
I just wanted to emphasize, I guess, is that in my model, the agglomeration effects are even increased in the work from home, because the expansion of most productive cities is going to drive in more in-person workers in there. So of course, this will depend on the parameters that I have, but effectively in my model, work from home increases those most productive cities to the detriment of the less productive places, even in terms of density.
Thanks very much. I'm going to keep us on time.
Thank you for the questions.
Thank you so much for having me here. I'm just waiting for the slides to load. So my name is Yichen Su. I'm currently at Southern Methodist University. And so this is a joint work with Franklin Qian at UNC, University of North Carolina. I feel like this is a little bit more formal than I expected, so I feel underdressed definitely, but I'll try to manage my nervousness. Okay, so I mean, this city is really, this paper is really about the future, like our view about the future of cities, right? So as we all know, COVID-19 pandemic had triggered a massive remote work revolution, and during the peak of the pandemic, right, about 2/3 of all of the work hours supplied were supplied remotely. And since then, that number has come down to like, about 30%. It has since converged, right? And so I think it is pretty, and I think it's becoming more and more obvious to people that we are now sort of seeing a sort of more or less permanent shift in remote work, regime. And so with the permanent adoption of remote work, there's obviously a lot of labor market implications. But for me, an urban economist and a city lover, this triggered a lot of, worry, right? I mean, including real estate developers, right? The people who hold these assets. They're very worried about, the future of cities, right? Because, based on the traditional view of city centers or urban centers, at least in the United States, urban centers traditionally viewed as a place of, a destination of commuters, right? The people coming into work, there's these huge office buildings. And so a side effect of remote work is that there's going to be reduced flow of commuters into the city center. And that generates a lot of worry, right? So a lot of people are it's like, the future of the city is doomed. And it's not just economists, right? If you turn on the news, you see that all the time. And so what we try to do in our paper is to kind of counter, in a very cautioned way, counter that view. And so we're going to try to argue that instead of killing cities, remote work seems to be transforming cities from a destination of commuters more into a destination of leisure travelers, and or in a slightly looser term, it's going to transform cities into from more of a producer city and into a consumer city. So that's sort of the idea of what we're trying to show here. And this is an empirical paper, so we're going to present our conceptual argument, and I'm going to show you a lot of empirical evidence to support our argument. There's a headline, tons of them, And so before we talk about our conceptual framework, why we think remote work could actually generate a positive effect on urban economic activity, we want to first start with the conceptual framework behind the urban doom view, right? What is actually going on within this framework? And then we're going to try to say, okay, this framework is a little bit simplistic. So almost all of the model with remote work has some kind of a flavor of this. So basically, city center is a place of tradable service production, right? These office buildings, and so this is where a lot of commuters come in, and because of that, they also attract a lot of residents, right, to save commuting time, and therefore you have the presence of both commuters and residents, and because of that, it generates a huge amount of urban amenities like restaurant, retail, etc. All of that. So it's sort of this. All of that ultimately depends on the presence of commuters, right? And then from there, you build all these other economic activity. And then what remote workshop does is that it exogenously reduces both the commuters and the residents that live in the city because of the need to commute. And because all of that other stuff is ultimately built on the need to commute. Once you remove that, that's going to, really severely damage the economic activity in the city center. And because remote work is like a permanent shift, that decline in economic activity is likely to be permanent, right? So that is basically like the doom worldview. And so we want to show that the worldview actually depends on some very sneaky implicit assumption that we almost never think about, but they're actually quite important. And once you remove those assumptions, the effect of remote work on city centers is actually quite ambiguous and may actually be positive, right? So the first assumption is that city center is inherently a center of production or tradable service production, and so and then the amenity provision and all the other activity are sort of the byproduct, endogenous byproduct, and we, as urban economists, even before the pandemic, we already have seen so many papers that have shown that city centers, especially those with very high density, seems to have inherent advantage of providing urban amenity. They're just very valuable place to go, right? People really want to go there, right? Like New York City, Chicago downtown, and stuff, places like that. And so even if the commuters go away, these places probably are still very, very attractive, right? And so this is what the first assumption that we relax. But relaxing this one assumption is actually not enough. Why? Because there's another assumption that's very sneaky in most models, which is that amenity demand comes from local residents and commuters, right? So in other words, the people who visit urban amenities are the urban residents and the commuters, right? And why is this important? Because if remote work is adopted permanently, then you have a lot of people moving to the suburbs or away from the urban center, and that's going to mechanically take away the foot traffic, right? From the city center to the suburbs, and that's going to lead to a decline in the city, a doom in the city. But this assumption is actually not. It's pretty shaky, actually, if you look at the data. A lot of residents travel for urban amenities from the suburbs. I mean, even though they live in the suburbs, they travel into the city to enjoy the amenities, and so the foot traffic occurs in the city, even though they live somewhere else, right? And this is actually becoming more true with remote work, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about this. And once you relax this assumption, you can see that if city center has very high exogenous amenity value, they're just very valuable, and people travel for amenity, then you can see that even as people suburbanize, right, they change their housing location to the suburb, this could still anchor foot traffic in the city center, right, once you relax those two assumptions. However, this is still not enough, because this, even if you relax these two assumptions, the effect is still unambiguously negative, remote work's effect, right? Because even though some people want to travel into the city center, if people are still suburbanizing, there's still going to be some negative effect, right? And so that brings to the third sneaky assumption, which is that consumers' overall pool of time for amenity is like fixed, right? And so this is so if people spend a fixed amount of time for amenities, then if people move away, yeah, that's going to drive down foot traffic in urban center. But that's also a kind of a crazy assumption, right? If you don't have to commute, and you also don't have to go into the office, I have a lot of free time, right? If I have a lot of free time, that really changes how I manage, whether or not I decide to travel for fun, right? And so there are two effects. One is a mechanical effect. Now I spend more time for leisure. So that could boost urban amenities, foot traffic, right? So that's one effect. But the more important effect is that now I don't have to commute and I don't have to go into the office. I might be more tolerant to travel far, because I don't mind traveling far, right? Because now I don't have to commute. And what that does is that all these mediocre places that I used to settle for, okay, forget about it. We're going to the real deal. We're going to the place that I really enjoy, and those tend to be in these big, dense amenity center, right? And so as a result, you can actually get more traffic in these high-density amenity hotspot at the expense of these more mediocre ones. So that's sort of so you can see that once you relax all three assumptions under the right condition, it could actually completely change the conclusion of a working from home's effect on the economic, the spatial distribution of economic activity. So that's sort of the central thing. And so the other thing I want to mention just before we jump into the empirical stuff is that we find that relaxing these assumptions doesn't do very much on residential, like the donut effect, right? The donut effect is still going to happen regardless. The biggest impact is on the prediction on amenity foot traffic, right? So we're going to predict that the amenity foot traffic is not going to do very much, to say the least. And if the reduced commuting time actually relax people's time constraint, it's actually going to increase the demand for urban amenities. So that's sort of the model. Okay, just a preview of the evidence. So, and residential, if you look at the residential population, the donut effect, people are staying suburbanized, right? There is no evidence for reurbanization. I'm going to show you more of that later. And we also, and we also saw that these urban centers, especially these high amenity urban centers, are seeing very strong recovery in amenity foot traffic and spending activity. And more importantly, you can see that the visitors who visit these amenities, they're increasing coming from further away. So it's like they're increasing coming from the suburbs as people move to the suburbs, right? And then, that's kind of the preview. The only other thing I want to say about the conceptual framework, trust me, this is an empirical paper, is that the pandemic released two shocks, not just one shock. Especially when we analyze foot traffic, it's very important to realize that. So the first shock is the remote work shock, which is more or less a permanent shock, right? But then there's a temporary shock, which is an amenity aversion shock, right? Because there's COVID floating around, right? You don't want to go out, right? So if people don't want to go out, that has a huge impact on where people visit, right? And so why is it important? Because during the pandemic, with this amenity aversion shock, the central city, the places with very high amenity, is going to suffer disproportionately because of that. Why? Because ordinarily these places receive a lot of inbound visitors, right? And when people are not going out, they are going to suffer disproportionately. And if we erroneously think that that's because of remote work, that's wrong, right? So we really have to look at what happens after the pandemic is fully over, and then look at what the recovery trajectory and what happens there. So that kind of motivates our empirical finding. Okay, very briefly, so the main data set that we're going to show you today come from the advanced SafeGraph foot traffic data. So this is like mobile phone-based data reported at the establishment level, and we also know the NAIC code of the establishment. So this allows us to see the commuter traffic and the amenity visiting traffic, right? And this is reported monthly. I know that there's a lot of weird kinks in the data. So if some of you have worked with this data, we've spent a lot of time trying to bridge those weird kinks. So if you see the smoothness, if you're weirded out, we can talk offline. And so the next thing is that we're also complementing it with SafeGraph spending data. So this is like credit card, debit card transaction at the establishment level, but the sample is much smaller. And we have some other data. We can talk about it as we go. So the first thing I want to say before looking at the traffic data itself is I want to convince you that there is really no reverse. There's no evidence that there is systematic reverse migration back to the urban center as of recently. So this is coming from the New York Fed Consumer Credit Panel, and this is actually coming from another paper of mine. And so here we're plotting the change in the distance to downtown for all of these samples in the microdata. So essentially every quarter you can see where people are, and then we just take the difference between the distance to downtown that you are this quarter minus the distance to downtown of you in the previous quarter, right? So if you didn't move, that number is going to be 0, right? So here you can see that during the peak of the pandemic, this movement to outward is really kind of going through the roof, right? So this is the donut effect. And then since then, it has come down. But there's no evidence that this, for there to be a reversal, people moving back to the city, this has to go below 0, right? And this is far from 0. So this donut effect is actually still going on. So there's no evidence of that reversing itself. And you can sort of see the same thing with rent growth. So here we're plotting rent, normalized rent to 2019 level for urban center, which is 5-mile radius within downtown and the suburbs. And you can see that rent trajectory in the suburbs far outpaces the urban center, and that gap is not closing. If people are moving back, we should see that closing, and that gap is actually widening, and you can see the same thing with home value as well. So I hope I have already convinced you that the residential is in terms of residents, right? They're not sort of moving back to the city, but I'll show you that foot traffic pattern, very, very different. Let's just start with like the overall picture. This is American time use survey. So we're plotting the time that people spend at workplace versus time people spend at amenities. So you can see that in 2020, both of them saw a huge drop, right? So a huge drop. But for people, the on-site time, people who work on the time people spend on site, on their work site, that has pretty much been stable since then, right? This is we kind of already know that. But if you look at the amenity people spend in restaurants, stores, and entertainment venues, that had dropped out even bigger cliff during the pandemic. But it has since been on a very fast recovery trajectory, right? So this is sort of overall picture. So here, this is from the SafeGraph data. So this is mobile phone visits. So this is all of the country, right? So we're plotting the trajectory of amenity foot traffic and commuting trips for in establishment in suburbs and the urban center. So this is like the solid line are the amenity foot traffic, and two things I want you to take away, right? So the first is that amenity foot traffic to urban center really suffered the most. but then the recovery is also the fastest, right? And this is also faster not only relative to the amenity foot traffic in suburbs, it's also faster than the commuting trips, right? So this is sort of the first graph I want to show you. And by the way, this is the least dramatic graph. So everything is going to be more dramatic, because if you plot the same graph with a very well-known monocentric city like New York metropolitan area, the pattern is like much more dramatic, right? So you can see that amenity foot traffic to urban center of New York metropolitan area dropped very steeply, but then it recovered very fast, and now is actually totally back to normal, and it's much faster than the recovery of commuting trips. And you can see the same thing with Chicago is pretty much exactly the same. And San Francisco, okay, this is a weird place, all right? I don't know why people just don't go out. But you can sort of still see the same kind of pattern, right? This big drop in urban foot traffic, urban amenity foot traffic, and then a big recovery since then. And then, some people say, okay, maybe this is all about long-term vacationers, the tourists. So one thing that we can do is to split the sample into weekday visits and weekend visits, right? So here you can see that weekend visit is really leading the way, for the recovery of urban amenity foot traffic, and especially in places like New York, right? So you can see that weekend visits to amenity in Center City, New York, is actually far outpacing the pre-pandemic level, right? And same thing in Chicago. And also, you might be wondering, okay, maybe this is your visiting data. That's like kind of weird, right? So here we can use the spending data, like the SafeGraph spending data. This is credit card transaction. And you can see, so here I'm just plotting the fraction of all of the retail spending as the fraction of all the retail spending that occur in establishment within the urban centers, right? Out of all of them, and you can see that the fraction dropped temporarily during the peak of the pandemic, and it has since recovered and some more, right? So this is another piece of evidence. And then here is the visitor coming from further away evidence, right? So here we're showing you the trajectory of the mean distance of the visitors visiting the amenities in the urban center versus the suburbs. So basically, the visitors to all of the amenities are coming from further away. So people seem to have a lot of time visiting like far away amenities, but particularly for amenities that are located in urban centers, all right? Okay, so all of those very interesting, I would say, but they're coming from a dichotomy, sort of a very simple urban versus suburban binary structure. So one thing that we can do is that we can zoom in finer, right? So look at the like Midtown Manhattan versus West Village, right? So if the idea, if this recovery that we see. Some people are concerned that this recovery that we see is really driven by commuter behavior, right? So this really, maybe it used to be that commuters don't like to go out for lunch because of COVID, and now they can, right? So what we can do is just to look at neighborhoods that just offer amenities, right? People probably don't commute into these neighborhoods. So, so the first motivation I want to give you is this. So here we rank the entire country's neighborhood based on amenity like popularity. So this is like foot traffic density before the pandemic. And then by percentile, we just plot the trajectory of the foot traffic, and you can see that really the highest, like the most popular neighborhoods saw the biggest drop in foot traffic, but then it has since recovered spectacularly. And then what's more is that the foot traffic now is actually, they're attracting proportionally more foot traffic than all of the other all of the other neighborhoods. I think I'm running out of time, so I'm just gonna hurry up, and I have a lot of stuff. So I will just show you this regression, and then I will conclude. So the idea, one thing that we can do is to separate neighborhoods into places like CBD, places where there's a lot of white-collar worker, where we expect a lot of loss of commuters. And then we can look at other neighborhoods like West Village, right? There's a lot of like popularity there. And then we summarize these measures into RS. This is like remote shock, measure. And then, so this measures how much more likely this is a central business district, right? And then AM is like the amenity popularity. And then we can run a time varying, run a regression where we allow the coefficient to be time variant. So here's the result. And this is like really interesting, right? Because here the black line is the time effect by the remote shock, right? So this basically tells you that the places where you expect a lot of commuters to disappear, the foot traffic around them to amenities, the foot traffic to amenities around these neighborhoods saw a drop and then sort of just stayed there. But then the places where there's a lot of amenities to begin with, it has nothing to do with really commuting. They saw a big drop, and then it kind of recovered disproportionately, right? And then we did the same thing with consumer transaction data, and we found basically the same thing. So this kind of really tells you that there is this two things going on in the city, right? One is the remote work shock, that people are not coming in. The other is like they're really attractive for amenities, and people are wanting to coming back, right? So I have a lot of other stuff, but I'm really running out of time. So you kind of already know what I've already said. So basically, we're trying to counter the idea that remote work is going to kill cities. It seems like cities' role as an amenity is like the key to saving the city, and we show quite a number of empirical findings to back up the story. Although there are some more I wish I could show you, but that's all.
I'm quite sympathetic to the overall theme about cities becoming centers for consumer amenities. One thing I'd be curious to see maybe in the next paper is, has there been a divergence across the cities that were major sources of consumer amenities before the pandemic, but they've had very different recoveries? You already showed a little bit of that in the contrast between San Francisco and New York. My casual impression is that San Francisco hasn't recovered because they've had bad city governance. This is back to my point about transforming tax revenues into valued consumer amenities. And I suspect you'll see broader patterns of that. So you showed us mostly conditional mean outcomes, but I expect there's a lot of heterogeneity in the recovery of cities because they've adjusted to the shocks you talked about with different degrees of effectiveness.
Mm-hmm. Well,
Thank you. Sorry. This is such an interesting paper. I was just curious, I assume you have like time of day information. So, and maybe that's one of the graphs you wanted to show, but I'm curious, like, especially in the weekday, if people's time is more flexible, if you think the future cities will also change in the timing of the amenities they offer, be it later in the middle of the day.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I don't have that graph. So we were actually working on that using microdata. So you can actually see exactly when and where people are visiting. So that we're definitely going to look, because one thing that we saw was that when people work remotely, it's the day before that they're starting to go to have fun, right? Like, so I'm suspecting that has something to do with like staying up late. So that, so there's a lot of those we can explore. Yeah. I think Nick has
Super interesting. I was going to say, just what for firms, I guess is for cities like New York, their office sector seems to be doing fine, in part because it's next to amenities. So you kind of want your office next to someone nice. It also means for these disused offices, it's easy to repurpose the first floor because you just put a shop in. It's more problematic for like floor 20 where no one. So yeah, great, really interesting.
Yeah, great, thanks. I think there's some over there. Oh.
Yeah, thanks. Quick question and then a bigger question. One of the last tables that you showed with the amenity value, the time varying amenity value, what was the outcome variable in that regression? Was that like
sorry. Yeah, it was foot traffic. Yeah.
Foot traffic. Okay, and so then the right-hand side was amenity, and then one was remote, and so you showed the amenity was went up. Okay, super. So this goes back to a good point that Steve brought up about differential public governance. So do you know the emergent MSRB Muni underwriting data? Okay, well, this would be I mean, so we'll talk more afterwards, but basically seeing every underwriting record that counties have issued, and so the yields on that will tell you something about whether or not remote work is being capitalized into kind of city infrastructure. And so you can look at like general obligation bonds, revenue bonds, et cetera. So I think that might be a critical mechanism for uncovering how remote is being priced and how cities are adopting.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that's a good idea. Yeah, one thing we were worried about that, like, remote, all these fun people are coming in, but how much like tax revenue are they gonna bring? So that, yeah, absolutely. I think.
So, I had a question, very related to Steve's point, which is, do you have any evidence for why the dynamic now is what it is, with cities being centers of consumption? Whereas in the mid-20th century, when cities really shrank and activity moved to the suburbs, there was more of a doom loop. Is there, I mean, I think we can tell stories about how the characteristics are different now and then, but I don't know if you have any evidence or any ideas of where we might get evidence.
Yeah, first of all, crime was like, I wrote a paper on gentrification like way before this, and so that was like the thing, right? Like it was really dangerous, and so yeah, there was a lot of. So the other thing is that I think I briefly mentioned that it's actually a really important mechanism. Is that remote work actually makes people want to venture out, right? And I think I feel that, other people told me that, and we can see it in the data, right? So now people are kind of like, oh, I can work remotely, let's work in that Blue Bottle coffee shop. and then, when I'm done, I could just immediately jump to these fun places, right? A lot of that is going on. So yeah, I think that back then we didn't have that.
Yeah, and maybe the follow-up question, which you don't have to answer, is why wasn't there more of a doom loop in other parts of the world? So say in Latin America or in Europe during the mid-20th century, as activity could move far away from the city center, whereas in the US there was. That's
that's a good question.
To my previous question.
I don't really have a good answer though, but that's a good question. Yeah.
So pre-COVID, essentially, urban centers were really good places to work, and now they've essentially transitioned into really good places to live. Would that be a fair perception?
Okay, that's related to gentrification. So when I was, a PhD student here, I was working on the gentrification paper, and so the gentrification paper. So basically, gentrification was like people, like all these high skilled workers are moving into the city, right? And so it's sort of like. But this, we actually saw kind of the opposite. Aside from New York is like a really notable exception, right? Like every other city, we saw like high skilled workers like moving out, and so, but their foot traffic seems to be moving in. So it's like there's some weird thing going on with, like, So
living by meaning. The amenities are there. People can go in and commute and engage with those amenities, and then go back to their urban or their suburban areas when they want to. My question is, if you look at municipalities and you had like 20 seconds, top 3 suggestions or top suggestion, what would you say to municipalities that are looking at these problems and trying to solve it?
Yeah, I think, okay, I'll answer it this way. So in the theoretical model, when we're trying to work out the effect of the remote work, I think remote work. So remote work actually has a first order impact on where people want to live, right? So as long as remote work keeps going, this donut effect, it just seems like it's not gonna go away, right? And so the only way for these urban center to, like, maybe not the only way, but important way is to get these people to visit. Because because with remote work, there's kind of little reason for them to just live there, because like commuting is like a big thing that determines where people live. I think I need to maybe move on to the next.
Yeah. Thanks so much. Yichen, that was great. And Stephanie, great. And next up is Stephanie talking on shopping.
Okay, hello. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm Stephanie Johnson, and this paper is called Shopping from Home. It's joint work with Nick and with our co-authors, Scott and Jana. Okay, so in this paper, we asked the question, how does remote work change shopping? And to answer this, we ran 3 surveys on Nielsen IQ panelists, asking them about how often they work from home, both currently, so this is in 2022 and 2023, but also we asked them to recall their work modality both during the early pandemic and before the pandemic. We also asked them questions about their shopping behavior, so whether they primarily shop for groceries in person, or using an app for curbside pickup or delivery, and some other questions about the use of grocery apps. We can match this survey data to very detailed data on those households' purchases. And we'll use this to answer several questions. So we show that remote work does change shopping behavior in several different dimensions. So firstly, there is a strong effect of working from home on shopping from home. So people who work from home are much more likely to do their grocery shopping online. We also see that remote workers are more likely to do shopping on weekdays rather than on weekends. We also look at how this changes product composition. So we see that households shift towards purchasing more food and away from some other products like health and beauty products. We see that overall households spend more on the products that are covered by the Nielsen data. So for those of you who have used this data, you can think about things that you would buy in a grocery store or in a drugstore, those types of products. So we see spending on those things increasing, and we also see households purchasing greater quantities of those things. We also see that households buy a broader variety of products than they did previously. So in this data set, what we see is the UPC. So you can think of this sort of definition of the product as being very specific. It is like a specific product and a specific pack size of that product. So we see households purchasing substantially more distinct UPCs when they start working from home. And then we also see some fundamental shift in terms of households like price sensitivity. So when people start working from home, they actually become somewhat less price sensitive than they used to be. And we see this in several dimensions. So households obtain fewer deals. They are more likely to buy somewhat more expensive products within a particular product category. And we also see that they become less price sensitive as measured by their price elasticity. Okay, so we ran three waves of the survey. The first wave starts in mid-2022, and then we had 2 follow-up waves, one later in 2022 and one in 2023. At each wave, we get about a third of households responding, which is reasonably high. And across the 3 waves, we actually cover around half of the households with at least one wave. Households in the Nielsen panel stay there for quite a long time, on average 6 to 8 years. So even though we can only get survey responses for the panelists who were there in 2022, we actually have a lot of information on those households back prior to the pandemic as well. So this is a couple of screenshots from our survey. So the first question we ask households for each day of the week. whether they were working from home or at the employer or client site, or whether they were not working 6 or more hours. So we asked them about every single day of the week, and we do this for 3 different time periods. So the time period you see here is the pre-pandemic period, so we tell them February 2020. We also ask them about early pandemic and then about their current work modality, which would be in 2022 or 2023, depending on the wave. We ask them about their shopping behavior as well. So this is their primary method of grocery shopping. So you can see the options for that are primarily in person, primarily online and use delivery, and primarily online and use curbside pickup. So the survey captures pretty well the overall trend in work from home. So we see the big increase in work from home during the pandemic, and also that this comes down a little bit and remains like at a pretty high level since then. In the paper, we also do several other tests to validate the survey, and we can see that so for instance, we look at the ACS and look at occupation by state cells and see how our recall survey responses line up with those, and actually it lines up very well across all 3 periods: the pre-pandemic recall, early pandemic recall, and current. So overall, the survey, as far as work from home is concerned, looks pretty respectable. Okay, so then we merge the survey data with the scanner data. There are 2 data sets, a consumer data set and a retailer data set. So in the consumer data set, basically the household is scanning their grocery purchases. So you can see everything that they buy. You can see exactly what it is. You have this UPC code, how much they purchase, the date of the purchase, the retailer they purchased it from, the price that they paid for it. And you can also see whether they used a coupon or whether they perceived the item to be a deal. So we also have this perceived deal indicator. But on top of this, we have a retailer data set as well. And so this gives us data on posted prices for store by week by UPC. And we can combine these data sets to give us a sense for, not just the price that household paid, but in principle, what were the prices that were available to that household at times when they didn't buy the product, and in other stores where they didn't buy the product. So our main work from home measure is constructed using up to 2 household heads. So Nielsen defines a male household head and a female household head. In our survey, we actually allow potentially all individuals in the household to respond. Not all of them do, but we use information on the household heads that we have data from the survey for. So our work from home measure is the sum of work from home days for the up to 2 household heads divided by the total days worked. And for most of the analysis, we use a long run change in work from home. So this is the work from home post-pandemic, so at the time of the survey, minus their work from home before the pandemic, which was this their recalled work from home. And because we have 3 waves, we actually have 3 data points for each of these time periods, potentially if households respond to all waves. So we average the responses that we have for each household within each of those time periods. Okay, so our main empirical approach is we use this, post versus pre-pandemic change in work from home, and we look at how, various outcomes evolve over time for households who moved more towards work from home than others. So we have household fixed effects, time fixed effects, and we're going to plot this estimate of the beta t, so we are tracking the dynamic response. And the idea with this is that the pandemic basically gives us like the timing of the shift to work from home for these people. But by defining this work from home measure as being post-pandemic minus pre, we're focusing on people where that work from home shift was persistent. And when I plot the coefficients, you expect to see firstly, that if there is an effect, that the beta will change around the time of the pandemic. But another thing that we're looking for is that this effect is persistent. And in pretty much all cases, we see that the effects we document persist all the way through to 2023. And so this shows that what we're documenting is like a fundamental effect of work from home, not just some kind of transitory effect that is due to the pandemic. Okay, so first I'll talk about shopping modality. We see that work from home increases online shopping. There are a couple of ways that we can measure online shopping given the data we have. This chart shows effects on the share of spending at what Nielsen classifies as an online store. So the retailers in Nielsen are anonymous, but they do provide information about the type of store it is. So for example, is it a grocery store? Is it a drugstore? Is it an online store? And so this is nice because it comes from the scanner data, which means that we have timestamps on it, and so we can show the pre-trend and everything. The downside of this data is that it only captures spending at retailers that are kind of truly online. So thinking about Instacart and things like that. Whereas if what you're doing is, say, you're using the Kroger app for curbside pickup or delivery, Nielsen is still going to classify Kroger as grocery. And from the scanner data alone, it's actually not possible to determine whether this was an online purchase or an in-store purchase. This is actually one of the advantages of our survey, that it allows us to pick up that type of online purchase as well. You can see here that there is an increase in this online shopping share that does coincide with the pandemic and persists to 2023. And this effect is actually very large. So the baseline for this online channel is 3.4% of spending in 2019. And so what we show here is that if you shift from this work from home share of 0 to 1, that increases this online spending share by about 1.5 percentage points. So that is a lot compared with the 3.4% initially. And so we also asked households in the survey about whether they're using the grocery apps. And this just plots, broadly for pre-pandemic, early pandemic. And currently, what that looks like, depending on people's work from home. So if we were to use the main specification, the estimate we get here is that this form of online shopping increases by about 5 percentage points. So if you look at the overall pre-pandemic level, about 10% for the somewhat work from home groups, about 10% of people were shopping, were primarily grocery shopping online, and this was about 5% for full-time in person. So this 5 percentage point increase is also very substantial and kind of in line with the other online shopping measure as well. And we see households also increase weekday shopping. Weekday shopping increases by about 3 to 4 percentage points, and typically people do about two-thirds of the shopping happens on weekdays. Okay, so looking at spending composition, we see that households spend about 10% more on the products that are covered by Nielsen. And we also see that quantity increases substantially as well. Later, I'll show you that as well as the increase in quantity, they actually also pay higher prices for things too. If we look at this by product category, we can see the most pronounced effect is for food. And there's really not much discernible effect for things like health and beauty products. We see some shift towards general merchandise as well, which includes things like, printing and office supplies and that type of thing. And then we see that people actually buy about a 10% broader set of products. So it looks like they change their product composition fairly substantially. But they don't actually change the number of retailers they shop at. So we didn't find any effect on number of retailers. And then finally, we find that they become less price sensitive. So this is the Nielsen deal measure. Working from home implies about a 1 percentage point reduction in deals. And the baseline for this is about 20%. So it's about a 5% reduction in deals. We also find that people buy more expensive products in the same category. So let me just explain exactly what this measure is. So we compute what their kind of counterfactual spending would be if they bought exactly the same set of UPCs at the annual average price for those products. That's what's in the numerator. And then we compute if they paid for each of those UPCs actually the average price of the product group in which their UPC lies, and then add that up, and that is the denominator. So, for example, if you are thinking about cheese, which is one of the product groups, it's things like cheese, cereal, crackers, that kind of level of aggregation. If you are kind of buying the average type of cheese in terms of its price point, this measure is going to be 0. If you are buying more expensive cheese, this is going to be positive, and if you're buying cheap and nasty cheese, it's going to be negative. And so what this shows you is that they're basically, paying 2% more, not for an identical product, but for a product that is in the same product category. Okay. And then this is a measure we construct to think about whether they're shopping at more or less expensive retailers. So the numerator is, again, what their counterfactual spending would be if they bought the same set of UPCs at the annual average price of the retailer that sold them that UPC. And then in the denominator, this is what their counterfactual spending would be if they sold, if they bought that UPC at the kind of national retailer average price. And so it looks like they are not shopping at more expensive retailers, but they are buying more expensive products within product categories. And this table shows a few different outcomes together. This is a somewhat different specification in which we actually control for the online shopping survey measure, and where we use all of the variation in work from home. But we see very similar results here. So in particular, so column 2, that tells you that they're paying 0.3% more for exactly the same product. So this is like Diet Coke in exactly the same pack size. Column 3 says they're paying about 1% more for a very, very specific product category. So this is something like American cheese slices. And then in column 4, which is also what I showed you with the other specification, this is that they're paying 1.5% more for a very similar product like cheese. Okay. And then finally, we show that work from home does reduce price sensitivity. So we compute price elasticities. And to do this, we need to do some aggregation because obviously we're going to have a lot of zeros here. So we aggregate to work from home group by week by product. So the work from home groups here are now, we say that they are switches if they increase work from home by at least 50% of days worked from pre-pandemic to current. And we see that there's a pretty substantial proportional reduction in price sensitivity for those who work from home and during the post period. Something to keep in mind here is that actually a lot of the variation in grocery prices here is the prices are typically set at the national level. So it's pretty well documented for large retailers. They kind of tend to set basically the same price everywhere. So think about that in terms of interpreting the price responsiveness. Okay, so we find that work from home does have substantial effects on household shopping behavior and on consumption. It increases online and weekday shopping. We find they buy broader sets of products, that they spend more on these grocery items. And overall, that they seem to be less price sensitive and maybe prioritizing convenience in terms of things like their online shopping and shopping around for deals and so on. And this in turn has potential implications for retailer pricing strategies. Thank you.
This is a wonderful paper. Thank you so much. I do have two quick questions. How should we think about sort of the welfare of having this broader variety in UPC codes, right? Is this something that oh, I did want to try that other type of cheese? Or is it, I was trying to get the same Ziploc bags, but I accidentally got, Ziploc extra large by accident?
That's a good question. It's hard for us to know that given what we've done, but thanks for bringing that up because it is, if one of the channels is maybe households spending less time on shopping, it could be that part of this could be accidental, but it's not something that we've actually looked at.
I think the other thing that I'd love to hear about is how we can think about the less price sensitivity, right? Because you imagine that if I'm shopping online, it's much easier to have a tab open for Walmart and a tab open for Target, rather than if I'm shopping in person and I actually need to go between the stores in order to find my deal. So it seems as though we just have greater availability of information, which should make it much easier to find the cheaper price. But that seems not what you found.
That's an interesting thought. So the first thing I want to say here is that actually the price sensitivity and deal stuff is not specific to people who shop online. We also see it for people who report primarily shopping in person throughout the entire period. But another interesting thing, we asked them about the way that they use the app. And one of the things we found is that when people tend to add from the saved cart, they actually end up paying more. This is something that I personally do a lot of. I spend a lot less time shopping now, and I always use the same app, and I just add the same stuff from the previous orders. And when you do that, you are much you don't look at what other stuff is on sale or available, or you're just adding what you bought last time. So it could go either way. Yes.
Just a point. That's a great point. So the surprising thing is it's about work from home. We also look at the interaction with online. And
that's right.
So it's work from home rather than online that drives it, which is maybe surprising.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask you whether it is a price of income effects, following up on the previous question, meaning marginal people who are tipped into working more have more income, and so they look for higher quality varieties of goods, or like the previous question, I have more time to shop, so even if I'm buying a higher quality item, I've been looking for the lowest price such item. And so I still take the advantage of having lower cost at comparing alternatives.
Mm-hmm. It's is an interesting point. So I think something we would like to do is to try to look at how much time people are spending, because it's also not obvious to me which way it would go. Because if, for example, you can now shop on weekdays, but you also have work commitments on weekdays, even though you're working from home, you may actually spend less time shopping, and you may be more conscious of, I have this flexibility, and I have, fun activities I plan to do and things like that. So it's not clear which way it would go in principle. As far as income and so on is concerned, so I suppose you might be worried that these work from home switches also have different kind of like time trends in terms of income and so on. Actually, like the results are all robust to including controls interacted with the time dummies as well. We actually know quite a bit about the household, their occupation, education, age, some information about their income in buckets and so on. And actually, like, the results are very similar, both kind of with and without those controls.
So I was interested in sort of how much you think this could partly be people aren't eating out quite as much, like particularly if they're working from home, they're not eating lunch out, and so now it's just like they might have some sort of mental accounting where it's like, I used to be spending X on food, now I'm still spending way less than X on food because I'm not eating out. I don't know if there's anything in your data that could get at it, like if you've ever asked people that, or whether you could just see whether it's concentrated in people who are just buying a lot more calories, and so that they must probably have been eating out more and now they're just like eating at home more or something like that.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. That's also a great point. I have a feeling we did ask a question about frequency of eating out, but we haven't actually used it. In terms of being very precise about this, though, we really can't see how much money they spend on the products that are not covered by Nielsen. There may be other ways we can try to get at this, but that's certainly like a possibility.
Could you also look at the retailer data to see if they're changing pricing strategies, but also seeing if they're introducing new UPC codes, UPCs?
That's a good question. It's not something that we have looked at. I think we sort of thought about it, and you would have to use some kind of like, because with the retailer side, it's not like we have a work from home measure for the retailer, so you would have to use something like ZIP3 work from home shares, which does get a bit coarser.
Hello, interesting presentation. I had a question about inflation. I guess I'm wondering whether the shift to work from home is inflationary, because you obviously had inflation in 2021 onwards, and in particular you had inflation in grocery prices. So I'm wondering whether you're able to kind of gross up your estimates of price elasticity to kind of decompose the rise in grocery inflation in the US into a non-work from home effect and a work from home effect.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. That's also a good point. So there's various senses in which we show households are like paying more, a little bit more, 0.3% more for exactly the same thing, up to maybe 1.5 to 2% more for very similar things. So yes, like in principle, this could affect, retailer pricing and inflation.
I also have the question about inflation, but since that was asked, I also wonder why you use the share work from home per household, because I think a more relevant matter would be whether the primary shopper in the household is remote work or not.
We did also ask questions about who the primary shopper is, but fundamentally, all of the shopping outcomes are really mostly at the household level. So this is why we defined work from home at the household level. Okay.
Can we?